Hey guys, real quick before we start, if you were wondering where I've been, I've spent the last few months working on my next game. It's a much bigger project than Flipknot, which is the free game I released last year, and to be honest, it's still going to be a little while before I can share any information, but here's a little sneak peek at the main character, and eventually I'd love to start making devlogs for the game in the future, so if that's something you'd like to see, definitely let me know. The other thing I've spent this month doing is playing way too much Baldurs Gate 3. I wanted to make sure I completely finished it before making this review, and I'm glad I did because my feelings on the game have changed quite a bit over time. If you've been living under a rock and haven't heard of Baldurs Gate 3 yet, let me fill you in real quick on the spiciness. Baldurs Gate 3 is a CRPG made by Larian. There's been a lot of drama, okay? There's been a lot of controversy in the gaming sphere surrounding this game. The headline I've been hearing time and time again is that Baldurs Gate 3 is making AAA studios very grumpy because it's just so good. And yeah, this is a really good game, but I think this whole thing has kind of been blown out of proportion a bit. Don't get me wrong, a studio releasing a massive game at a reasonable price with no paid optional content or microtransactions is an unfortunately rare thing these days. It's no secret that large video game studios have gotten greedier and formed entire games around the model of loot boxes and skins and microtransactions. In that sense, Baldurs Gate 3 is a great example that you can find massive success without any of these scummy tactics that we're used to seeing today. I would love to be hopeful that this is going to be a new trend for larger studios. Honestly, the sad truth is that it probably won't change too much. I think the real meat and potatoes comes from the fact that Larian Studios, although a really big company with like 400 employees, is still an indie company. Without pressure from massive investors or production restrictions, an indie studio has the freedom to make whatever they want, really. And they can take as long as they want in doing so. That's one of the reasons I think indie games are so special. They don't need to feel like they're driven by hitting quotas or time frames or sales. Without those factors confining them, indie games create truly special experiences that are driven by passion first and foremost. So regardless of whether or not this has any effect on AAA games, I think it's a clear sign that we should be paying more attention to indie games on the whole. There's also been a huge string of AAA companies shutting down recently, like the dev studio behind Saints Row. They had one real stinker of a game come out, and it's forced them into shutting down completely, which is pretty sad because Volition had some really great games in the past, but it's also a sign of the industry changing as a whole, and showing that pressure from big investors and time crunching is actually a path to destroying your business. And as sad as it is, I am hopeful that this kind of thing does have an actual impact on the games we see in the future. But I also definitely don't want developers to take the wrong message from this. The proof is in the pudding. Games that take their time to release, instead of pushing out an unfinished mess, are the ones that make the biggest splash. It's not about making the most money as fast as possible. It's about making something meaningful and complete, because players aren't stupid. There's a reason why the front runners for the Game of the Year this year are games that have been delayed time and time again, and because of that, they were able to reach their full potential. Okay, now that we've gone ridiculously off topic, we gotta remember that this is a review, so let's actually talk about the game now. There's a minor spoiler warning. I won't be talking about story specifics, but I only started recording around Act 2 and 3 of the game, so there may be character design related spoilers that you might not want to see, so if you want to go in completely blind, sorry, my fault, but that's your warning. So if you're like me and you've never played a CRPG before, don't worry, I got you covered. Baldurs Gate 3 is based in the world of Dungeons & Dragons, a tabletop role-playing game that utilizes dice rolls to determine the outcome of the story. Because Dungeons & Dragons has been around for many decades at this point, there's already a ton of lore and history and systems to draw from, which thankfully you don't need to know anything about going into the game. I've got friends who didn't even realize this game had anything to do with D&D, so it's super beginner friendly in that sense. The thing that I definitely enjoyed the most about Baldur's Gate 3 is its story, which is an interesting line between open and linear experience. You start out by creating your character from scratch, and just like D&D, you can decide from a huge list of fantasy races, classes, cosmetics, and your starting abilities. To be honest, all this stuff is a lot to take in if you haven't had any experience with CRPGs, or any tabletop RPGs for that matter. But the good news is that you can't really go wrong here because your character is going to change a lot over the span of the game. I decided to make a human bard as my first character. I liked the idea of this hero carrying around a guitar everywhere, so that's what I went with. The one thing that everyone will have in common in this story is that you're on a journey towards Baldur's Gate City. But what you do along the way and how you interact with the world is genuinely completely up to you, depending on the choices you make with the party members you come across, and actually just everything in the world will be completely defined by what you want to do. Even the race or class you choose right at the beginning can have a major impact on the way you're seen by others. Drow are mostly hated by everyone, while humans and elves are much more popular. To give you an example of how different these playthroughs can be from one another, at one point my party was fighting off invaders in a town, and I was having a really hard time getting through it, so I looked up a video on how someone else did it, and it turns out that this person had actually joined the invaders by this point, and were actually on the opposite side of the battle. It's pretty mind-boggling to think that if I made a different choice somewhere down the line, I could be someone completely different. That's where Baldur's Gate 3 is at its strongest, in my opinion. Seeing my choices fall into place and all be very relevant throughout the entire 100-hour playthrough I had was extremely impressive, and something that I honestly didn't even think was possible before this game. The choices you make are also rarely black and white. Sure, there's the occasional choice that's like, are you gonna kill the orphan refugees? Which seems kinda obvious what's morally right. But I'd say 90% of the decisions you make are kind of just deciding what your character might say in that situation, and that may or may not lead you down an unexpected path. There's also the factor that so many of these decisions, whether you're lying to someone or trying to convince someone to do something, that's all based on dice rolls. Because I was a smooth-talking bard, there were times where I could get out of entire boss battles by just convincing them to unalive themselves. The choices alone were satisfying, but the fact that most of the time it came down to rolling some dice, it definitely adds to the stakes of the story on a more personal level, which is something that I've never experienced before in a video game. I also have to note how amazing the characters and especially the party members are. First of all, the game is fully voice acted, even by all of the random background NPCs you come across in the world. All of the voice acting is also very strong and immersive. It's crazy the level of quality given in these performances. The biggest standout for me was the narrator, who spoke out your character's internal dialogue, and they also read out every sign or writing on walls. It was a lot, but whoever did have that role added so much charm to the game. But back on the party members themselves, to me this is where the real story comes from, even if they aren't directly linked to the main plotline. I always talk about how much I love games that focus on character development, but what's so special about BG3 is the fact that development of these characters is so clearly linked to your own journey. If you have a strong enough bond with someone, you can actually start to influence their goals and direction with your own actions, which leads them to developing in a way that makes sense for your own story, but also just makes sense for their character in general, no matter what path you go down. It'd be hard to pick a favorite of the party members because they're all really so unique, and it would be fun to go back and replay the game just to see how their lives would be altered if someone else had joined the party. We are going to get into the combat and bugs and all that good stuff, but I want to note that the story of BG3 as a separate entity is honestly a 10 out of 10 experience for me, and one that I hope we see reflected more in story-driven games. Sure, there are confusing moments at times or bugs related to the story, but if we really look at this element of the game for what it is by itself, I think it's something incredibly unique and groundbreaking. So let's talk about combat. If you know me at all, turn-based battle systems are my favorite kind of combats, and there's only so many games that put an interesting enough spin on things that makes the slower action feel fun and rewarding. I'm very happy to say Baldur's Gate 3 has an amazing combat system. Now, this is my first experience with a CRPG, but if they're all like this, man, I've been missing out. The ability to jump into combat at any moment with any NPC is awesome. The whole world is like a battlefield with well thought out vantage points and multiple ways to get the upper hand. It's just another way that your choices of how you want to play are all yours to make. These are very minor spoilers, so skip ahead if you don't want to hear them. But in Act 1, there's a giant goblin camp within the ruins of an abandoned cathedral. Of course, being a bard, I decided to talk my way in and make friends with the goblins. But you could also gather allies through the story to raid the camp as an army if you wanted. There's also a bunch of paths that you could sneak your way into the base without being seen if you like the stealthy approach. If you really didn't care about that plotline, you could just skip it completely and find another way around the camp. There are really so many ways to approach scenarios like this, and the fact that the whole overworld seems to be built around its combat system, every option is viable. So depending on your class and how you've built your character, you're able to unlock and upgrade tons of abilities for combat. Fighters, for example, are best with weapons and traversing the battlefield. Clerics gain a bunch of healing and buffing abilities to keep the party alive. Warlocks use aggressive magic spells to control the battlefield. No matter which class you choose, there's always a ton of really fun abilities to unlock and experiment with. I also love that these abilities are all so unique from each other. They kind of remind me of the boons from Hades, where they are all really good, but depending on the combination, you can cause some real mayhem. By the time you've gotten to the higher levels, your party basically become gods. When I think back on my favorite turn-based games like Persona or Octopath, you eventually reach a point where things get a little repetitive in the flow of combat, but honestly, they never really did in the over 100-hour journey with BG3, and I think that really comes down to the versatility of how you can approach combat and how fun it feels to get stronger. And now that I've praised the game to death, we gotta talk about the elephant in the room. When the game first came out, there were a shocking amount of bugs, especially when it came to combat. There were minor things like spells not doing the correct amount of damage, or characters popping in and out of existence, and then there were also bigger problems like enemies not taking damage at all, soft locking you in battle. If you didn't know, Baldur's Gate 3 was in early access for basically 3 years, restricting players to Act 1. I am a huge fan of early access. I think it's one of the best ways to get direct player feedback on what works and what doesn't. But that being said, it is kind of obvious. Everything in Act 1 works almost perfectly, and the start of the game is really impressive for how ambitious it is. Unfortunately, as soon as you enter Act 2, where the early access ends, the rug gets immediately pulled out from under you and the bugs start to become a real nuisance. By the time you reach Act 3, it gets pretty frustrating. Characters are invisible during key scenes. One time there was a cutscene that took place in a beta test room. It didn't ruin my experience in the slightest, but if bugs are a big deal to you, you might be a bit disappointed and maybe even feel lied to by the amazing experience that is Act 1. It also feels like a lot of character-related story threads die out completely with no proper conclusion, which for me is a big issue. I definitely want to make it clear that as of writing this video, Larian has released 2 massive patches to the game that fix a lot of these problems, including missing story moments, but it's a bit sad to say that it'll probably be a while before the later chapters reach their full potential. In conclusion, Baldur's Gate 3 is one of those games that I think I'm going to remember for a really long time, and for all the right reasons. However, if you're someone who's a stickler for bugs and we're just on the edge trying to decide whether or not to get the game, it might not be a bad idea to let it cook in the oven for a little while longer. I do have a lot of faith in these devs that eventually this game will reach that potential they were aiming for, and with how responsive they've been to players and how quickly these problems have been getting fixed, I'm sure it'll get there in no time. I actually can't think of the last time I played a 100-hour-long game and immediately wanted to play it all over again. But with the sheer amount of choices and paths to go down in Baldur's Gate 3, I actually want to dive right back into it. 2023 has been probably the best year I've ever lived through when it comes to games releasing, and there's still so much yet to come out. I'm pretty excited. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you guys think of Baldur's Gate 3. Keep on gaming to the fullest, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.